uh, if you live here in the Wake Forest area or somewhere else, please give us your name, please, if it's your first time with us.
Um, well, this is my first time with you all, and I'm actually in the Garner community. I start by saying my name is Thomas Bunch. I'm independent pharmacy owner in the Garner community, and we represent Garner Fifth Avenue Pharmacy.
Mhm.
Okay,
Welcome.
thank you.
Glad you're here. Is there anyone else?
Hi there, everyone. My name is Pamela Owens, and I am with Renew Mobile Showers. We are a brand new nonprofit in the area that will be providing shower and laundry service to our unhoused neighbors.
Oh, wonderful. Glad to have you with us on tonight. We'll be talking with you. I have your contact information. Thank you. Is there anyone else?
Hey, my name is Officer Eeks. I actually work for Wake Forest.
Officer.
Hey, how are you?
We're
So I'm
good.
just here to see what's going on and see if I can help you guys anyway, or if you guys have any questions, or see what's going on maybe in the community.
Thank you so much
Of course.
for joining us. Anyone else? Well, tonight we have Brad West with the Town of Wake Forest Planning Department. He will share some things concerning the affordable housing plan for Wake Forest. We also have Thomas Bunch, a pharmacist and owner of Garner Street Pharmacy in North Carolina, in Garner, North Carolina. Thomas will talk about the upcoming flu vaccination event to be held on October the 11th, 10 a.m. at Faith Tabernacle Church, 714 East Juniper Street in Wake Forest. We're going to ask that Thomas go first, please, and please, if you have any questions for our guest on tonight, please feel free to ask them. That's why they're here. So at this time, we will hear from Thomas.
Okay, once again, my name is Thomas Bunch. I'm owner of Garner Fifth Avenue Pharmacy, and we are a traditional pharmacy, just independently owned. We're in the Garner community, and we provide vaccines for vaccine preventable diseases. In addition to traditional pharmaceutical services. Like this afternoon, I guess they want us to speak a little bit on the flu vaccine for this season. And so the influenza vaccine is a vaccine to help reduce the risk of contracting flu, as well as reducing severe illness associated with the influenza virus.
Mhm.
So this year we have the 22-23 influenza vaccine, and it's a traditional vaccine, and the vaccines just became available this past week. So we will start vaccinating. Actually, we've begun today, and the actual flu season traditionally begins around end of September, October, and runs through maybe March or April. So the vaccine should provide protection against the current influenza virus that we. And I'll have to kind of get you, I don't remember the actual makeup of this year's vaccine, so I have to get a copy of that and I can tell you about that. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's like an H3N2 combination product. And essentially what that means is you're talking about the surface components of the virus itself. The two basically surface antigens that we just talk about when we're talking about influenza. It's the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase, are the surface components of the virus itself. And that's what basically the vaccines are made up of, those components, to sort of introduce to your body those components, those surface antigens, so that your body can build antibodies against it, essentially is what it does. Okay. And, you know, the vaccines are typically deactivated. They use a chemical, generally formaldehyde, to deactivate it. So it's not a live vaccine. Most people don't have allergic reactions to these vaccines. Most of them they will use egg embryos in order to sort of produce the virus. And it is parts of the proteins of the virus is what's being used. Okay. And usually once you get immunized, it usually takes approximately 2 weeks for process what's termed seroconversion, which essentially is your body's immune system having adequate time to build up its defense against the foreign substance that's introduced.
Mhm. And can you share for us the insurance, and for those that don't have insurance, can you talk about that?
Sure. Generally, for those who have insurance, the vaccine is typically free. We're billing the insurance for basically our services, our time spent immunizing. The actual component, in most cases, the actual product itself is generally not covered, but there's an admin fee that's usually covered by insurance. For those who don't have insurance, my price runs about $25 per person for the vaccine. For a standard vaccine, you know, there's and it's considered a quadrivalent vaccine, which basically means that it protects against 4 different strands of the influenza. And then there's a vaccine that we use for people who are 65 and older. It's considered the high dose vaccine, which is kind of twice as much of the actual components of the vaccine for people who are a little bit older, which means their immune system is not quite as active as it once was. So they require a little bit more of the dosage. And that's usually running about $40 for people who don't have insurance. But for the most part, people who are 65 and older will generally have Medicare, and Medicare will cover that cost for them. So it's still free for people who are generally 65 and older.
So there's no vaccine for children?
Well, the standard vaccine, depending on which one you use, starts at age 6 months. So the vaccines that are available this year, the one that I use, which is called Fluzone, that's just the manufacturer of that particular brand. It starts at age 6 months and it goes all the way up to 64, age 64. Pharmacy can only vaccine by law, by state law. You have to be at least 3 years old in order for us to vaccinate. We can't vaccinate by law anyone younger than 3. Prior to the COVID pandemic, we were only able to vaccinate children who were 10 years or older. But with the COVID vaccine, there were some laws that were sort of, changed a bit so we can help with the pandemic. So we now can vaccinate children that are 3 years and older.
So if parents were to bring their 3-year-old, they would get the vaccination on the 11th?
Just if they were 3 years or older and the parents consent to us vaccinating, we would be able to vaccinate a 3-year-old. We've been vaccinating 3-year-olds and older with the COVID vaccine. So we could vaccinate a 3-year-old with the flu vaccine.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions or concerns? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Thomas. We have enjoyed the information that you shared with us.
Sure.
And I'm glad to know that children can be vaccinated on October 11th, and we will share that anyone, any child 3 years of age and up can get the vaccination.
Okay, all right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Right.
At this time, we will have Mr. Brad West with the Town of Wake Forest Planning Department.
Excuse me, Reverend Caldwell. Before you go further, let me give you the correct address. It's 741 instead of 714. 741.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any questions, Pastor Harris?
No, only thing you said October the 11th and the time frame. What would be the time frame? We would need to have the church open
Okay, 10 o'clock.
from 10 until.
Thomas, is there a particular time that you will stop vaccinating? We have no idea right now how many want the vaccination.
Okay, it can be open.
Is he still on?
No, he left, but
Oh, okay,
we'll keep it open.
okay. At this time, Mr. Brad West with the Town of Wake Forest.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Can you all see this screen, the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm Brad West. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager over the Town of Wake Forest. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of our new draft housing affordability plan. So many of you on this call likely realize there's been a significant increase in housing costs, not only in Wake Forest, but in the Greater Triangle area and many other jurisdictions and fast-growing metropolitan areas around the country. And as a result of this, we're finding it, folks are having a really difficult time finding a house to either rent or own. And Wake Forest residents are acutely aware of this. And so back in 2020, to give you a little background, the Board of Commissioners for Wake Forest approved a 0.5-cent property tax increase. And this was designed to start funding some targeted affordable housing initiatives to help kind of alleviate some of these housing cost issues. And so the housing affordability plan is the first of these initiatives funded by this 0.5-cent property tax increase. And so in the overall objectives for the housing affordability plan, we wanted to, before we move forward with this project, and by the way, I should mention, a lot of the work, the content, I should say, in this plan was done by HR&A advisors, our housing consultants. They usually give this presentation. I am not a housing expert, admittedly, but I will try my best not to stumble too bad in this presentation. But they did a lot of the research and legwork for some of the policies and demographics information you see in this plan. But generally, what we're trying to accomplish here is take a look at kind of the existing conditions to get a snapshot of our population, see if there's some trends and demographic information that we can identify. We also wanted to take a look at the local housing conditions. How has our housing market changed in the past 10, 15 years, and see if we can determine any kind of trends there. And from those two existing conditions analyses, we were going to look at who's most vulnerable to these rising housing costs. Which groups of people are struggling the most? It's kind of a universal problem. Just about every income level, except for the very high, are experiencing some housing cost issues right now. But who among them are the most affected? We also wanted to establish a vision and associated goals for housing, what we want housing to look like in our community. And then we wanted to recommend specific policies to actually achieve that vision. So we boiled it down into 5 chapters in the housing affordability plan, and I'm going to go through each one of those real quick. So the introduction to this plan, just so you know, as an FYI, this was a 12-month process, and we broke it up into different phases throughout that 12 months and did periodic engagement throughout the way, and we'll get into engagement here in just a minute. So the first chapter with content in it, actually, I should say, is the demographic chapter. And again, this is just a snapshot of Wake Forest's demographic situation, any trends, takeaways we could identify from that information. I won't go through all the details of that plan, and at the end of this presentation, I can send a link to the chat of the actual draft plan, but I'll give you some highlights that we found interesting. No surprise, there's been significant population growth in Wake Forest. I think there's been a 58% increase from 2010. New growth is driven mostly by high income earners earning more than existing residents. So this is important because there's some potential displacement pressure being put on existing residents that make less than these higher income earners that are moving to Wake Forest. Our renter to owner split right now is 70% homeowners, 30% renters, which is pretty typical for a suburban community like Wake Forest. Seniors, we've identified as experiencing the highest housing cost burdens. They are typically on fixed incomes, and they don't have a lot of flexibility to adjust to take on these additional costs. Black and Hispanic homeownership rates are lower than, far lower than other racial ethnic groups. We're actually seeing, and I think we might cover this in the next slide, we're actually seeing homeownership rates decrease across all races and ethnic groups, but especially so with those two. And so we did another existing conditions chapter, but this time it was focused on the housing market. And so HRNA did some analysis on the current prices that we're seeing, and also like the incomes tracking for both renters and homeowners. And so the American Community Survey is a great resource, publicly available, free to use, that tracks a lot of this data. And so we heavily leaned on that for some of this information. But what we couldn't get there, our consultants filled in with some analytical tools that they have access to. So some summaries and key takeaways, most, and again, not a surprise, most of our growth in Wake Forest occurred in the post-war era, as they say. So after World War II, but particularly in the 90s and 2000s. So a lot of our housing stock is considered new. When you compare it to some of the like Rust Belt cities or older cities in the Northeast, you have more of a mix. Home values in Wake Forest are higher than anywhere, or higher on average than in North Carolina and Wake County on average. And one very interesting point is new homes for sale are over $200,000 more than the average renter household can afford. So why that's important is because most of the first-time home buyers are renters, non-surprisingly. So it's very difficult for a renter household. Let's say you have a young couple or a kid or something and they want to move to a house. That average household is $200,000 short what it costs to buy a new home in Wake Forest. Wake Forest is 82% single family homes, which is not super surprising for a suburban community. It's a little high for single family homes, but it's pretty reflective of most suburban communities in the Triangle area. But we are seeing that mix shift a little bit. To give you just a little more context on that, we recently adopted a community plan that calls for some targeted density, especially around transit lines and potential transit-oriented development areas, where we can see more of a mix. So that number, as time will move forward, may fluctuate some. And so the outreach chapter just kind of covers and this is a very general overview of the outreach. We put it into 4 buckets. We had an advisory committee of housing experts and community leaders on, I think we did 3 or 4 meetings throughout the whole process. And what we do is we break up this project into chunks and we deliver it for them to review. They are the experts. They know more about housing than we do. So we had them review to just make sure that what we were putting out there made sense and that we were addressing sort of all the issues that are on the table, at least in terms of what Wake Forest is dealing with. We also had a public input survey. We had an online version of that. We had a paper version of that. We had stakeholder interviews. So people outside the housing expert committee, we would go out to target different community members, different experts. What we found especially helpful is talking to real estate developers, because what I'll talk about here in a minute, a lot of the issue is a supply issue for housing. And so if we can get more supply, that theoretically will alleviate some of the housing costs, or at least put downward price pressure on some of the housing units out there. So we want to make sure whatever we're recommending in this plan makes sense from a developer perspective. Market rate housing, even adding new higher end housing, puts downward pressure on home prices just because of simple supply and demand rules. So we want to make sure that what we pitch makes sense there. And we also met individually with the board commissioner members. Before we came rolling out with this plan, we wanted to make sure that some of the policies that we were advocating for in this plan sort of aligned with the board commissioner's vision for Wake Forest. And so the most important chapter, obviously, is the action chapter, the implementation of this plan, so we know the snapshot of Wake Forest, we know some of the housing conditions, we know who's most adversely affected. And so how do we do, what do we do to fix these, or at least ameliorate some of these housing issues that we're seeing? So we broke it down into 3 strategies for how to move forward with housing affordability policies. So the first one is expand and preserve home ownership. So in our outreach, we found home ownership, amongst especially Black and Hispanic residents is decreasing. And so we want to make sure that we can try to stabilize that. And so there's several different programs available for exploration that can deal directly with home ownership. And real quickly, I'm going to try to run through these as fast as I can. So down payment assistance program, this is pretty straightforward, where the town or an entity would contribute a certain amount of funds for a down payment. Usually it's like a percentage and up to a certain amount. So just right off the bat, the homeowner's responsible for paying, or the potential homeowner is responsible for paying a certain percentage, and then the town would be offering a certain percentage. And that would be income qualifying. So that would be targeting 60% or below the area median income. Community land trust model is an interesting thing that's starting to take off around the country and proving fairly successful, at least from what we can tell. So the way that works is, instead of you buying a house and buying the land underneath that house, which drives up costs significantly. So in case you guys don't realize, land is really driving a lot of this cost issue, in addition to limited supply. So the closer proximity you are to a desirable location, the higher those land costs are going to be. So if you have the land owned by a community trust, so commonly owned, these trusts can then sell the individual housing units by themselves, almost like kind of like a condo unit. And so that significantly reduces the cost. So you could have a single family house in an area that would normally be completely unaffordable to some renter households, for instance, all of a sudden become somewhat affordable for many income levels. You would still get some appreciation of value. It wouldn't be as much as if you own the land, obviously. But that specific location and space has value. I mean, if you have the exclusive right to occupy that space with a house in close proximity to a desirable area, that still conveys value. So we have seen value increases in the community land trust model. So it's so far so good with that. We have owner-occupied rehabilitation program, which actually we kind of put the cart before the horse here. We actually started the owner-occupied rehabilitation program last year, before this plan was even adopted, or even in draft form, I should say. And so far, year 1 has just passed. So that ended June 30th, and we're working on a year-end report to share with the public on how that went. But as I got the inside scoop, it went really well. And we served several, I think it was 6 or 7 homes this first year. We got funding from our Board of Commissioners for another round of the housing rehab program. So we'll be taking applications for that second round coming soon. But I think actually our nonprofit partners, Rebuilding Together the Triangle, indicated that they already had a batch of applications ready to go. Incentive zoning is, and again, I'm going to try to break these down as simple as possible, but there's this thing called inclusionary zoning in a lot of other states that mandates that when developers put out large housing projects, so like let's say a large apartment complex, they are required to reserve a certain percentage of units for like lower to middle income residents. So if you build, 100 unit apartment building, you got to reserve 15 of those units for, or 20 of those units for people making a certain amount. And usually it's lower than the area median income. So that's illegal in North Carolina. Our state legislature does not allow that. So we have to come up with fun, creative ways to still get something similar to that, but in a legal way in terms of the eyes of the state. So incentive zoning is something that our consultants recommended we doing, where we put development carrots in the Unified Development Ordinance, which is our big development code that governs all development in Wake Forest, to lure them in to voluntarily provide what we call lower income or affordable housing or mixed income housing. And so incentives would be something like parking reduction or increase in height allowance or increase in density allowance, lot coverage, things like that. Things that save them a certain amount of money to make it worth them volunteering the affordable units. The last thing on this list is accessory dwelling units. So decades and decades ago, 100 years ago, when lots and lots of houses had what they called the in-law suites or in-law apartments or whatever built in the back of the house. Some people call them granny flats or whatever, but the technical term is accessory dwelling unit. And in recent decades, not a lot of home builders are building those. And so there's been a movement to, in order to sort of sensitively increase the density in single family neighborhoods where it's not very visually impactful, this accessory dwelling unit idea has been gaining traction again. And there's different programs that can incentivize homeowners to actually build these. And Raleigh is sort of a pioneer of that, of trying to get folks incentives, or at least make it easier for the permitting process to build an accessory dwelling unit in the back of your house. In fact, I think legally you're allowed to do it just about anywhere in the city now of Raleigh. And no, unless you have an HOA or something, it can't be stopped. Wake Forest is a little bit different situation, that we're a highly suburban community. Most of our development has been built within subdivisions that have HOAs. So even though we allow accessory dwelling units right now currently in most residential areas, it's still heavily impacted by HOA restrictions. So even if we said, yeah, go off and go forth and build ADUs and have little apartments in the back of your yards or whatever, most HOAs right now don't allow it. So this would really apply to kind of the older areas of Wake Forest that don't have HOAs. And the second bucket or strategy bucket here, we have rental housing. So we talked a lot about how to create more home ownership housing. So now we are focusing more on the rental side. So rents have gone up astronomically since COVID. Like, and if you check the plan out, there's a graph that shows kind of the rise post March 2020 for various different reasons. And it's getting worse now that mortgage rates are fairly high and many folks are now priced out of the housing market. They still need a place to live, so they're turning to rental housing. You also had a big movement of investors come in and buy up a bunch of single family housing in the last couple of years in anticipation of something like this. And sure enough, it happened. And so you have an even shorter supply of owner occupied single family housing. So that's what we're trying to tackle with these strategies. So the first one, we have public land disposition policy. So this is one of the most straightforward things the town could do to start generating some affordable housing units. This is used by many cities around the country, including Raleigh, where the town either has a surplus amount of land or goes out and purchases land for the purpose of affordable housing. They work with an affordable housing developer to actually build either a mixed income or 100% affordable housing project. And typically the carrot for the development community is that the towns or the municipality or whatever sells the land for like $1, a symbolic gesture. We're selling, basically giving the land away, but in return, the town gets, or the municipality gets, some desperately needed affordable housing units. And usually it's done in areas that are rapidly gentrifying or changing. And then there's little hope where the market would actually address that housing need. So that's a very effective improvement tool that municipalities use today. There's the public housing redevelopment strategy. So this is really focused on the very low income earning households. So you think of some of the Wake County Housing Authority complexes along like White Street and sort of there's a couple more. I think there's 3 total actually in Wake Forest. They're aging out. A lot of these were built in the late 60s and they're in desperate need of repair and refurbishment. And so there's different options that the Department of Housing and Urban Development puts out there to help redevelop these sites and still maintain some affordable housing. So there's a very complicated process on how to do that. I won't get into it here in this presentation because we're trying to keep it high level, but there is a pathway to work with the housing authorities to kind of redevelop these housing sites, maintain the same amount of units, if not get more units of affordable housing, but have a better aesthetic, have a better community feel, have it blend in better with the surrounding area, and give the residents the proper amenities they need. And the last one here, we have the low income housing tax credit gap funding. Another very complex topic I'm going to try to quickly go through, but the federal government distributes tax credits where basically you get a dollar for dollar amount reduction on your income tax. So developers compete over these and try to win them from the federal government. Actually, it goes to the state and the state distributes them. So they send in these applications like, hey, I got this great idea for an affordable housing project. Please give me these tax credits. Usually the developers, if they win these tax credits, they don't actually use it themselves. What they do is they sell it to a company to reduce their tax credits, and usually sell it for lower than what the tax credit reduction is worth. That way it makes sense for the company. But the benefit for the developer is that when the firm, whatever firm out there buys these tax credits, they just send this developer cash. And so the developer gets instant amount of cash infusion to build affordable housing, which is key. You know, cash is key. You need it right away to get some of these initial costs taken care of, materials, land, whatever. And so the LIHTC program has been extremely successful in generating affordable housing, especially for below 60% of the area median income, which is the threshold for that program. Only problem for Wake Forest is that it's such a competitive program. There's so many people applying for this. There's not many, and the criteria is very stringent. If you're just like 1 point off of their scoring criteria, you could have an almost perfect application. You're basically at the back of the pack because people are only submitting virtually perfect applications because it's so competitive. And we've done an analysis with HRNA, and we don't have that many perfectly scoring sites. So we don't want to lean on this too much, but in the event that we do have a good LIHTC site, this would be a good tool to use, where the town, and when we say gap funding, town provides a chunk of money to a developer to make a development feasible. So even if they get a LIHTC cash buy from a firm, and they still don't have enough money, a town or municipality, the Wake County could also come in and they provide that extra money to get them to the level they need where they could make a feasible development happen. Last one, we have build capacity and partnerships. So we talked about home ownership strategies. We talked about rental rental strategies. Now we're talking about just coordination and capacity building partnerships, things like that. So Wake County is doing a lot of work already in housing. They have a whole division dedicated to building or to housing programs. They get they're an entitlement community, so they get certain amount of money from the federal government to carry out certain programs. So we want to ensure that we're if we're duplicating efforts, that we're sort of working together and making sure that we're being the most impactful. If we need to split sort of our strategies up where they focus on certain income levels groups and we focus on others, that's a possibility, but making sure that we're sort of working together and coordinating to sort of maximize our impact with these programs. The town, we have a lot of talented people that work for Wake Forest, but we don't have a lot of real estate expertise. We don't have any amateur developers, as far as I know, town of Wake Forest. A lot of these strategies require some real estate expertise. So we either need to potentially hire some folks to work at the town of Wake Forest to deal with real estate transactions. Some other towns have a dedicated real estate person that deals with things like easements and developer agreements and buying land and things like that. And if we don't want to commit to a full-time employee, you could always partner with a consulting firm who has that expertise. Monitoring is an important one. So after we establish which strategies we want to take and are willing to take, we need to monitor to make sure they're actually being effective. And if they're not effective, how do we adjust them to be more effective? So that's an important thing for us to do as we move forward. Lastly, community engagement. So just the programs that we do end up going forward with, making sure that the community knows about them. There's a lot of programs out there that folks are they're very complicated and it's very confusing to many, your average people. It's confusing to me, and I've been working on this plan for like a year now. So I can't imagine what it's like for an average resident trying to figure out what's going on with certain programs and if there's funding and what kind of application they need. So any community engagement effort should really be focused on educating folks on the different programs available to them. And so the final slide here's our short-term initiative. So HRNA realized we have limited resources and 1,000 different things competing in the budget every year in terms of priorities, and we need to kind of hone in on specific actions we could take in the next couple of years. And so these are the short-term initiatives that were recommended by them. So finding some type of staff time, dedicated staff member to implement the housing plan and monitor how it's going. Creating a funding allocation plan for the housing initiative. So we mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we're collecting a half-cent property tax to fund these future initiatives. It's generating just south of, I think last time we checked, $350,000, which contextually speaking, and I know it sounds like a lot of money, but contextually speaking isn't a ton of money for stuff like this. And so we'll have to, depending on which programs we go with, have to re-examine that amount, see if we need more, see what the impact will be if we increased it or shifted the priorities around. And so that's going to be a very important step here moving forward after this plan. We mentioned monitoring, so establishing annual reporting, just making sure that the programs we are doing are effective and making sense. So we're doing that right now with the housing rehab program I mentioned earlier. Again, partner with the Wake County Housing Authority to sort of redevelop or reimagine their sites. We actually have some renderings of what the Housing Authority site on White Street could look like if it were redeveloped. And actually how the rear of that property could interface better with the Northeast community. So there's like a kind of a single family-esque looking version of it on the rear side of the property where it touches Northeast community. And then on the side that's facing North White, which is a more busy corridor, we get higher density and more active uses. So I encourage you to check that out if you can. Housing rehabilitation program, so I mentioned earlier, that's already underway and we're looking to start year 2 of that. Public land disposition program. The reason why they think this is a quick first step, it is the simplest, easily transactable, proven thing probably in this plan in terms of generating housing. And it doesn't require a ton of staff time. It's simply, you go out, buy a piece of land, put out a request for proposals from the development community, and the development community comes forward with different housing affordability proposals. The town gets control, what it looks like, how dense it is, what income levels it's targeting. We have a lot of control because we own the land. And so we get a lot of good community input on what that project should be like versus it being built privately just only within the development regulations, but not anything more specific than that. So that's why we think that's very useful for and the last one is the incentive zoning program. So we mentioned that. I won't go into the details of that again, but just are there carrots, are there things that will attract the development community to voluntarily include affordable housing within their developments? Again, like I mentioned, we cannot legally require developers to partition or set aside a certain amount of units for a certain income level due to state law. But Are there some nice juicy tidbits out there in terms of lot coverage and high density and building height that they would go for to voluntarily do that? And so let me stop sharing here. That is kind of the high level overview. I know I said a lot here, so if there's any questions, I will try my best to answer. Again, I'm usually the consultants are here to give you the nuance, but I can try to answer some high level stuff if anyone has a question.
I have a question, Brad, regarding the incentive program that you're trying to do with the developers. Did the town maybe consider limiting the amount of permit for the higher priced homes and increasing permit for more affordable homes?
So one big debate that was raging, it's still raging, I would say, in this housing affordability debate or discussion, I should say, is supply and how much supply and land use regulations play into the housing crisis. So I think HRNA's perspective on that is, and it's been backed up recently with studies, that adding supply, no matter what income level, whether it's luxury housing or low income housing or whatever, puts downward pressure on prices. Because so let's say there's a person making $200,000 a year, works at Apple and is interested in buying a home, and then there's me who doesn't make $200,000 a year, who's interested in buying a home. They're going to go after that same home if that's the only home available. But if you build, let's say, even a luxury apartment downtown, not too far away from this house that you're both competing with, they're going to move on to that higher price luxury apartment, and that makes it more available for the common middle class folks or whatever, or even lower income folks to actually go after that house. So any increase in supply offsets buyers to a different, I guess, batch of product, if that makes sense. But we can't limit, I don't even think we could do it legally, saying only houses that are priced at this point can be built. We would that'd be almost like a taking being like we are being too highly restrictive with land use regulations, where we're unfairly sort of targeting different price points and whatnot. And there's no legal standing for us to be able to do that. Although many people have suggested something like that in the past, only permitting no more housing unless it's affordable. But we're not legally allowed to do that in general. But overall, I'll just say it again, supply is a major contributor to the housing crisis that we're seeing. We need more housing units of all different price points and levels to put downward pressure on housing prices.
The reason why I asked is because I had experience with other municipalities that during their community planning did have a certain number for a certain price range. And it seems like Wake Forest is really directing lower income people to rentals rather than trying to have actual affordable homes that they can purchase here. And that's why I asked if anyone kind of ventured into to see if that was even a possibility. But I do know that has happened in other municipalities in North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, you can severely limit the amount of growth through land use regulations. That's certainly possible. But I don't believe, and I could double check with our town attorney, you can restrict income or restrict development based on the price point offered or whatever. So if it's only allowing homes that are priced between this and nothing else, I'm not sure that would fly with regulations. There might be, I'd have to learn more about what the examples you were talking about in North Carolina. There might be some nuance I'm missing in terms of what they did to get around that. But as far as I know, that would not be permitted.
Yeah, I think so, because it was all wrapped into the size. How you can restrict, well, it has to be this many square feet, can only have this much impervious surface, that kind of thing. So that's probably exactly what happened. It wasn't as straightforward as I asked the question, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. Yeah.
Is that a possibility that you're speaking of, like when they years ago, they had the dollar down houses?
You said dollar down houses?
Dollar down houses, yes. There are many that are still exist there in Wake Forest.
Oh yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about the dollar? I'm not.
Okay, if you go Walnut Avenue,
Mm-hmm.
okay, the first, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 houses there on Walnut. They were dollar down houses, but you had, and then if you wanted something different, like my mom, she had something different added to hers or changed around in hers. So the 3 across the street are basically alike. Then you have one on Franklin. It's, as I say, it's several in Wake Forest that they were built like 40 years ago. And see, and that gave many of the residents there a chance to purchase their own home. And it seems like everything has been pushed to the side and people really can't afford. And then, as you say, you have the developers that are coming in purchasing these houses, but they're not selling the houses, they are renting the houses, but then the rents are so high you can't afford the rent. So basically, there you go again, you've got a second shove of the people that actually lived, was raised there, born there, and they're gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that's exactly what's happening. And I'd love to dig into some of the history on dollar down houses.
That was Brad. That was a company called Jim Walters. He was a builder, and the houses were Jim Walters dollar down houses. That was in the 50s, I think.
Yeah, and Jerry Looper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's I had never heard of that before, so I appreciate you guys calling that out. I will say, with the land disposition program, the way City of Raleigh, I'll throw City of Raleigh out there a lot because they have a lot more resources. They've been a pioneer and they have a lot more land and displacement issues and from previous years. We're seeing that now, but they've kind of been ahead of the curve in that regard. But they have programs in the past where they bought up lots in neighborhoods that are experiencing serious displacement for the purpose of reselling or working with private developers to build housing. Usually they're smaller in footprint than what you normally get in a market rate, but restrict the sale to folks making a certain income level. I think in their programs, they have 80% of the area median income below. So just mentally think 80% of what your average household income would be. And there's been varying success depending on the kind of implementation of that. Their initial foray into that was restricting the sale of the house in terms of, okay, so we're going to sell you this house at a steep discount from what it would normally cost to buy a house market rate. But the catch is, and I say catch, but the catch is you can't sell it for 10 years because we're trying to stabilize the neighborhood. We're trying to keep people from, who are being priced out of their homes in a home. So you can't sell it for 10 years. If you do decide to sell it anyway, even though we're asking you not to, you're going to forfeit a certain amount of profit, depending on how long you've been living there. So if you sell on year 1, you got to sell like 90%, or you got to give up 90% of your profit. If you sell in year 2, it's 80%. Year 3, it's 70%, and so on. The longer you stay, the less profit you forfeit when you sell. And that's had some mixed results. I mean, it has resulted in folks staying put in these houses for longer periods of time than just buying and flipping them, selling the next person. But that neighborhood is still rapidly changing. This is a College Park neighborhood in Southeast Raleigh. It hasn't really stopped much. I mean, it slowed it down, but it's still full speed ahead over there. So now the cities, and there's still methods that could work. That was just one specific example. Now the city is looking at a community land trust model that's very much focused on maintaining affordable home ownership. And I explained that earlier how that works. But the catch with that, and most community land trusts require you, when you're wanting to move and you own a home in a land trust, they require you to sell it back to the land trust. So it becomes commonly owned again, and they sell it to someone else. They give you an agreed upon marginal increase in value. It's something that you usually work on when you buy the home. But there is an increase. Like I said, if you're near Oakwood, which this first land trust they're experimenting is, that's one of the hottest areas of Raleigh. And it's very difficult for your average person to buy a home there. So there's value, even if you don't own the land, and just being in that location. And so when it's time to sell, the theory is that you'll have folks lined out the door to grab that unit.
Excuse me. Thank you for all the information, Brad. My name is Joy Turner. I'm a member of the Olive Branch Baptist Church in the Northeast.
Nice to meet you.
My question about what you were just talking about, is that concept related to the old concept of rent to buy? There were certain restrictions where people could rent a home, mostly modest size homes in kind of developing neighborhoods, and they were allowed to rent the home for a period of time. And then at some point in time, I don't know when, the title would transfer to them as owners. And there were restrictions along with that. Then I have a question about some of the multi-units that are going on in Wake Forest right now. Are any of those units going to be targeted or even in a category that would be affordable for the average person? Or are they all very high income units, such as the ones around Harris Teeter and the ones on Route 98 and the ones coming in from Sheets off Rogers Road?
Yeah, so I'll try to go back to your first question. The rent to own model, I don't know of it being specifically, there are any stipulations about separating the land from the unit itself. I mean, I think just as a general concept, rent to own, once you own the house and the property underneath, typically, I imagine. And so the money you're paying towards that factors in land costs, which is a huge cost driver in these housing prices. The great thing about community land trust, again, is it removes that whole factor of land. Like, you're not worried about that land cost anymore, which slashes I'm not going to give you a number of how much it slashed, but it's a dramatic reduction in price. And you still get value increase over time. You get the benefit of being a homeowner, invested in the community, seeing your investment increase in value. But it just doesn't increase as fast as if you own the land. That's the only way you can really maintain the
Who pays the taxes in that case? Who pays the real estate taxes?
So, and I wish I had the consultants here in terms of how it's usually broken down, because from what I understand, it sort of works like an HOA. Like, if you live in a big condo building, so these are essentially like condo boxes, they are not on the land. I mean, they're physically on the land, but they work as like a ground lease. You basically have the exclusive right to have your little house occupy this space, kind of like how a condo works. The difference is, and I don't know if it's just like a condo where you just pay the taxes on what your unit, the box in the air is worth, that exclusive right to have that box in the air, to put it in like very simple terms, or if it's just all commonly paid through the community land trust. I don't really know the breakdown. That's a good question, and I'd like to learn more about that personally. And I'm sorry, what was your second question? It was about multifamily?
Well, it was about those developments that are going up right now by Harris Teeter.
Okay.
On 98 and going up the road from Sheets.
Yeah.
Many multi-unit buildings.
Most of the multifamily units that are being constructed now are what they call market rate. So those will be marketed to whatever the market dictates, which in this case right now is considerably higher than most folks can afford, according to our data. So you're going to see potentially more people from outside the community moving here with higher incomes, getting a lot of those units. We did have a new development Crenshaw Trace, I think it's called. It's near like the southern end of town. That is lower income, but I think that's only for seniors or 65 and up or something like that. The only area that's for like very low income is the housing authority properties. And like I said, they're in need of redevelopment or repair and refurbishment. The hope would be that we can work with the housing authority and HUD so HUD, I'm really trying to avoid getting into the complex HUD process of how you can redevelop these sites, because they're all basically operated by the federal government. So it's very complex on how you develop these, but there is a path. And the hope with these redevelopments is that you generate at least the same amount of units that exist there today, just in a much better condition. But the idea is you want more. If you're going to go through the hassle of demolishing, housing authority properties, and temporarily relocating people while the project is getting developed, the idea is like to make it worth it, you have more houses than you start out with, or more units than you started out with. So that's what we would hope to achieve if we partnered with them. But again, the big answer to your question, no, the majority of multifamily units are market rate. But as I said earlier, even though that's very frustrating, and it's frustrating for all of us that we're not seeing more units marketed towards middle to lower income households, it does put downward supply or price pressure on houses because there's just more supply. And so when you build a certain amount of, and it's a lot of people are always like, yeah, we've always heard that, and prices are keeping going up. But if you restricted it even more than you're restricting it now, prices would be even worse than they are now. It's just like any commodity on earth, like cars, lamps, whatever you have. If you restrict the amount of them, people are willing to pay more and more for those finite amounts of things. So a big factor other than land disposition that kind of as a market rate approach is just allowing for more housing to be built.
I have
Now,
a quick question, Brad, before we have to cut off.
yeah. Go ahead.
I just want to quickly ask, have you thought about partnering with Habitat for Humanity? They've done a great job in revising and building homes along the Spring Street corridor. And if the town has property that they can donate to Habitat, they can make it doable. And then the other question has to do with tiny homes in Raleigh. I know that we can build tiny homes on lots. And is that a consideration that the town has thought about?
Yeah. So the tiny homes, I just actually watched a really great video on a developer in Atlanta who's doing some kind of cottage court tiny home arrangements. But to answer the first part, you'll be happy to know Habitat Humanity representative was on our advisory committee throughout this whole plan development, along with other nonprofit partners. And so, they could certainly be a partner in terms of town selling surplus land or going out and buying single family plots in areas that are seeing rapid gentrification, and then working with Habitat to build more affordable single family homes to kind of as a neighborhood stabilization tactic. But yeah, the cottage homes or tiny homes movement is a home. I would call that a home ownership strategy, where you allow in the development code because a lot of development codes restrict the size of houses. You can't get really tiny houses, and it's various reasons why they do that. And it's usually to keep a certain character or whatever of an area. So there's a movement to sort of allow for more flexibility in terms of footprint size and whatnot. It's very controversial, though, I will say. A lot of folks in existing neighborhoods around the country fight it whenever it's proposed. So it has to be strategic in where you place it. It has to make sense. There has to be certain aesthetic checks and layout checks done to make sure that folks are comfortable with it. But some of the ones that I've seen, the good case studies that I think have really helped create small home ownership opportunities are very successful. And they almost become too successful because those prices increase rapidly once the word gets out how kind of cute and adorable they are, and how you don't really need a giant 3,000 square foot home. And you can downsize and you can still be in an area that where your job is, where you're going to school or whatever, next to amenities, versus our traditional model now, which is drive till you qualify, where you just move all the way out in Franklin County until you find a house that you can afford. And you know, with that's a good strategy for homeownership. So yeah, I agree, Betty.
There are a couple of tiny houses here in Youngsville. They've been here like 3 years and they have them in their backyards. But the tenants incentive leasing program, it works. I was a part of one in New York, and HUD and Housing Preservation were our partners. We were able to take a building and rebuild it from the basement all the way up to the roof, everything. We only paid $250 for the apartment itself.
Wow.
And that gave us shares. We had shares into the building. So that means that if someone has shares into a property, they're going to take care of it. They're going to want to stay there.
Right.
We didn't have to pay taxes because it came out of the building after 30 years. 30 years, they, you know, dismissed taxes. Some of the buildings were dismissed for 99 years. So that means they never had to pay taxes. We didn't have to pay for our heating. But then you stayed in the building at least 5 years. You had signed a contract that you would live there at least 5 years. And then if you sold it, we sold it at market value. So everybody wins. But then at the very end, what you do is a third of it would go back to your housing development. So that if anything has to be done, you took that money right there and you put the money back into your living quarters. You know, so everyone wins. And I think that that's what they can do here. And even to the buildings that are 80-20, you know, or housing complex that's 80-20. I don't see any of those many here. I heard something say about in Raleigh, they were building over in some industrial area. They're going to build some high rises over there, and they're going to be 80-20.
Yeah, and they were so we do this thing, this is another, when I mentioned fun, quirky ways of getting inclusionary zoning done without technically doing inclusionary zoning. One way that's frowned upon by our consultants, because the development community isn't thrilled about it, is the conditional zoning process, where through so like a developer comes to the town and wants to build a housing project, and the board, let's say our board of commissioners, has full discretion on whether or not they want to allow that rezoning to happen. They do have that right. They can just deny the rezoning for any number of reasons. Oftentimes, and this happens a lot in Raleigh, a developer, to make the rezoning application more appealing and more palpable for the elected officials, they'll throw in voluntarily some percentage, 80-20 or whatever, of units to be geared towards certain income levels as a nice, kind gesture to the town and our municipality that is reviewing this rezoning application. Sometimes it doesn't work and they reject it anyway. But it usually makes it easier to swallow for the elected body, and the elected body can say, hey, look, this is a high density thing, but it's going to be great in terms of generating housing that we desperately need for lower incomes. And so that's one way to get around the illegal forcing of inclusionary zoning. Any other questions?
Thank you, Brad.
Yep, sure thing.
We look to hear from you in 3 months or so to give an update on your next steps.
Yeah, I'll mention we're going to present the same presentation I gave to you all at the Board of Commissioners. I believe it's on Tuesday, September 6th. And then we'll have a public hearing scheduled for September 20th. And that's when folks can show up and make comments if you support the housing affordability plan or don't support, or whatever your feelings are towards the plan. You can show up and make that comment. And there's a I can send it Tilda if you guys can find where that sign up sheet is for public comments, but it's on our Board of Commissioners page on our account website. And the draft is publicly available as well. You all should, if you lived in Wake Forest, you would have received a postcard with a link on how to get there. But again, I can provide that to Tilda and she can distribute it out to the group. No problem. And I appreciate you all listening to that. It was a very long presentation. Apologies for the lengthiness of it, but we're excited to hopefully see this plan adopted and implemented soon.
You're on mute, Ms. Tilda.
Okay, next month, Michelle Michaels will be with us to give us the most recent update on the Northeast plan. So we look forward to that. And we have Officer Ely. Are you still on? Are there any updates you would like to share with us, Officer Ely? She may have had to drop off. We do have Representative Terrence Everett, and we have Commissioner Lewinsky on tonight. I know we have run over time, but if you know, I just leave it up to you if you want to say a few things. Terrence and Lewinsky. If not, Anjanae, do you have anything you would like to say? Okay. Well, we thank everyone for being on tonight, and we look forward to next month. We are getting ready to have a fish fry for fundraiser, so we'll talk more about that. We would like for you all, our partners, to come on and help us get that together and volunteer on that day. All monies will go toward our Juneteenth on next year. Thank you very much. No one else have anything to say? We will see you next month, and we hope that you have a great evening. Good night.
Is there a date for the fish fry?
Excuse me?
Is there a date for the fish fry?
We're working on that. We're
Oh,
working on
okay.
it. We're looking at toward the end of September, the 1st of October, someone like that.
Okay, okay.
We will let you know. Thank you so
All right.
much for asking.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.